Tonight's program, Recovery and Spiritual Change, will be presented by Dr. Libby Robinson. Dr. Robinson recently retired from the University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry, where she was a research assistant professor studying the role of spiritual and religious change in recovery from alcoholism. She has carried out 3 surveys of alcoholics examining this question. The most extensive study was a survey of 364 alcoholics who were interviewed every 6 months for 3 years. This work was funded by the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, part of the National Institute of Health. She was also an NIAAA post-doctoral fellow at the University of Michigan Addiction Research Center, and prior to that was on the social work faculty at Case Western Reserve University and the University of Buffalo. Dr. Robinson has an MSW and a Ph.D. in psychology and social work from the University of Michigan. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Robinson.
Okay. Can you guys in the way back hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And we're really going to talk about this big study that I did and what we found. It was called the Life Transition Study because hopefully people were transitioning into recovery. And so this is just a slide to sort of tell you where we're going to go over the next hour and a half or whatever it is. What were we trying to find out and why? How did we measure recovery, which is actually the thing they argue about more than arguing about how do you define spirituality and religiousness, which is kind of interesting. It's a political thing. Then we collected a whole bunch of information and we analyzed it, and I want to tell you who we talked to just in general terms, no names. I don't even know people's names anymore. Some major findings, because it's such a big study and there's so much that we collected, so much data, so much analysis that's been done, I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights, things that I think are particularly intriguing or essential. And some caveats, it's about studies in general and acknowledgments. Okay, so why might spiritual religious change be important in recovery? Most people, if you talk to everybody in the country or you take a random sample of people in the country, most people have some kind of spiritual religious life. 93% believe in God, almost 90% believe God watches over them. Only 14% have no religious preference. So 86 have a religious preference. This is as of 1998. That number's dropped, and fewer people now have religious preferences. And of course, we know about Alcoholics Anonymous, an effective intervention which has this spiritual basis, connection with a higher power, the use of prayer, meditation, working on these kinds of qualities that a lot of religions emphasize: forgiveness, service, gratitude, connection. And you talk to people in the recovery community and you talk to people who are treatment professionals, and most of them think that change in one's spirituality or religiousness is essential to recovery. As a matter of fact, we've got this Carl Jung quote. He said, this is in Latin, spiritus contra spiritum, or spirits against spirits. He saw this as 2 different kinds of spirits that we were struggling to cope with, and that we need to use a higher kind of spirit in order to recover from the trap of the not so healthy spirit. So, is there any evidence? Well, there's evidence, scientific evidence. We only like things that have been documented. So we find that there are, generally speaking, lower levels of alcohol and drug use amongst those with religious affiliation or participation. How many times do you go to church? How much do you drink? Those kinds of questions. there's some evidence that alcoholics and drug addicts are religiously or spiritually alienated, and we'll get into that a little bit further because I specifically investigated that question. And there's evidence, of course, that AA works. There's anecdotal evidence that spiritual religious change has been important in recovery. You all know the story of Bill W. And other stories from the recovery community where some aspect of spirituality, maybe religion, was involved in someone's being able to get sober and stay sober and really recover. And then there's a book called Quantum Change, which also documents a lot of these kinds of things. And there's evidence that spiritual awakenings, or as we phrase the question, life-changing spiritual religious experiences play a role in recovery. So there's quantitative evidence. This is another little intriguing tidbit. There's quite a bit of evidence that people's sense of purpose and meaning in life goes up as the longer they are sober. And we don't know which comes first. We don't know if having a sense of meaning and purpose helps you stay sober, or does it come when you are sober? So those are some of those kind of questions. So, of course, the first thing is, well, what is spirituality, religiousness? And we could spend the rest of the time arguing about that, right? Because everybody's got a different definition. And that was actually part of the study, which I won't be talking to you about. What do you think spirituality is? What do you think religion is? What do you think God is? This is the definition of spirituality that I hinged this work on. It's a very broad definition, deliberately. An individual's feelings, thoughts, experiences, and behaviors that arise from a search for the sacred, where I define search for the sacred very broadly, not just a divine being or ultimate reality, but existential meaning, transcendental truths. So, and for a connection to those phenomena. So this is pretty broad. I mean, this is, you walk outside, you see the beautiful blue sky, and it's like, wow. Is that a spiritual moment? Maybe. Religion, I see it much more in the social context as an institution, and all the rituals and prescribed behaviors around a specific institution, and usually in a particular cultural context. Now, and there are people who argue with you about those definitions. We won't worry about that right now. But we can come back to that later, because we'll leave time for questions. These are the primary measures of spirituality and religiousness that we used. I just wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we asked about. We asked about perceptions of God. We asked about beliefs and behaviors, current religious spiritual experiences, feeling God supports me, those kinds of questions. Values and beliefs. Forgiveness, there were 3 different scales on forgiveness because, as you probably know, forgiveness is a hot topic in recovery circles, so we thought we should do a good job of that. Religious coping, positive religious coping and negative religious coping were both measured. Negative religious coping is where you think God is after you, or God is punishing you, or something like this, where your relationship with God is more difficult, shall we say, and it's not a source of strength or support, this kind of thing. And I'm speaking generally, right? And then an existential meaning and purpose measure, purpose in life. And I put this in because I think it's funny. Calvin and Hobbes. Let's say life is this square on the sidewalk. We're born at this crack, we die at that crack. Now, we find ourselves somewhere inside the square, and in the process of walking out of it, suddenly we realize our time in here is fleeting. Is our quick experience here pointless? Does anything we say or do in here really matter? Have we done anything important? Have we been happy? Have we made the most of these precious few footsteps? And they stay standing there. This imponderable question. But I wanted to be sure that we covered these kinds of issues, because I think that this does play a role in people's recovery. So then there's this other question about, well, what is recovery? How do you know recovery when you see it? Does someone just walks up to you and tells you that they're in recovery? Oh yeah, sure, I know what you do. Whatever. So think about it. Do people, how would you define it? So there's really no agreement in the academic literature, in the treatment administration literature. Some definitions don't include abstinence. Some definitions of recovery do not include abstinence. Others do. I'm going for this one because I think it captures this idea that this is a journey. It's not a static thing. It's a process. You can be very early in recovery. You can be way many years down the road of being sober. And I wanted one that included abstinence because that does seem to be really important for staying sober with alcoholism. And it also includes this idea about improved health, wellness, and quality of life. So it's not just not drinking or not using drugs. It's also this broader idea about life is better. I have a job, or I have a place to live. My family is speaking to me, or whatever. We all have different issues. And it's hard to measure this. It turns out that this is a really hard thing to measure. How do you measure a process? Do I count you as being in recovery because you've been sober for a year? Is that how we sort of gauge the extent of people's recovery and the process that they've been through? So I think really the research on what is recovery is really young, and we really need to look at this more. Try to understand, and then we can support it better. So here are some dimensions of recovery that we looked at. Remission is this idea about no longer meeting the psychiatric definition of alcohol dependence. Abstinence patterns, we divided them up into less than 30 days sober at the final interview, 30 days to a year sober, or a year or more sober, based on the Betty Ford Institute criteria. And then quality of life is a broader idea about including social connections, mental and physical health, employment, housing, etc. Okay, so we did this longitudinal study of 364 alcoholics, and every 6 months we went and talked to them again, if they would talk to us again. And we asked about drinking, we asked about recovery efforts, we asked about health and mental health, spirituality, religion, and a bunch of other dimensions of people's lives. And at the final interview, which is about 2.5 to 3 years later, we had 276 people. We lost about 16 or 17 people, died, and the others just kind of dropped out, either saying to us, I don't want to do this anymore, or just not responding to our phone calls, which is fine. It's your right as a subject. So this is where we got everybody from. Chelsea Arbor Treatment Center, which is no more. It's kind of folded into the U of M treatment center. We got a lot of people from there, people from the VA, the Ann Arbor VA. There's a moderation-based program around. I don't know how it's doing at this moment, but we eked out 34 people. And then I wanted some people in the study who were not in treatment, because I wondered if their experience around spirituality and recovery, spiritual change and recovery, was going to be different than people who were in treatment. Because we know that most of the treatment programs in the area are 12-step focused, and so there'll be a lot of use of that kind of thing. So what's the story with people who are not in treatment at baseline? So we put ads all over the place. asking people who had alcohol problems and who wanted to participate in the study to give us a call. And we got 93 people that way. You had to have a verifiable diagnosis of alcohol dependence, used alcohol in the last 90 days, be over 18, not be suicidal, homicidal, or psychotic, literate in English. And those people in treatment had to be early in their treatment episode. Because I think there are different things going on the further you get into treatment. So this is what folks were like, about 2/3 men, 44 years old, about 2 years after high school, 2 years of education after high school. Almost 40% were married or cohabitating. About 82% white, 44% not employed, and quite a range of income. A lot of these people had been in alcohol treatment before, and typical age when they first started having problems with alcohol was about 26. Almost everybody had a family history of alcohol problems. And there's an alcohol problem score, a measure of the extent to which you have problems as a result of alcohol use. And that's a pretty high score, 21 on that particular thing. Also asked people if they wanted to be abstinent, because of course that's going to make a difference, right? In terms of what kind of drinking data you get. So we asked, but less than 3/4 wanted to be abstinent. And about almost 70% had at one time, before we first contacted them, had been to AA. So, interesting. Okay. So I thought it might be useful for you to see how much were these people drinking when we recruited them. Maybe all these people, they're really not that, they've been stable for a while. But, and this also gives you a sense of how the different sites were really different. These measures of drinking are measures drawn from a calendar kind of thing that we use, the timeline follow back, to obtain percent days abstinent in the last 90 days, percent heavy drinking days, drinks per drinking day. So on the days that you did drink, how many drinks on average did you have? And how many days since your last drink? And as you might expect, the people in the moderation management and the community sample, these guys here at the bottom, they had a drink not so long ago. Whereas the people in treatment are starting to get some time under their belts. So it's sort of interesting to see how the samples were really, really different from each other, which is a whole interesting thing. We won't get into that. Okay, so I'm giving you first a sort of a sneak peek at where we're going next. I'm going to talk about changes in drinking, changes in spirituality and religiousness, changes in spirituality, religiousness, and subsequent drinking, perceptions of AA's helpfulness. We dug around and found out what people thought about AA. We had asked about life-changing spiritual religious experiences, spiritual awakenings, as they're called in AA, and also found some interesting stuff around loss of faith and gender differences. So, check this out. This is percent heavy drinking days over time for everybody in the study. Right? This is the very beginning of the study. 3 months later, 6 months later, etc. So people really dropped from about 32% of the days were heavy drinking days to more like around 10. So there's this really big drop in how much people are drinking, which is really vividly illustrated in this slide, which is you bring in your statistician and you feed him data and he provides you with these cute charts But there's this group that started out, this is about 40% of the sample, and they started out at about 4 drinks per day on average, and per drinking day. And they dropped down to 2 by the time we got to the end. And then there's these people in blue, which is about 24% of the sample. They were consuming about 9 drinks per day, dropped right down and stayed down. And then the people in yellow, about 11% of the sample started really high, dangerously high, and they managed to drop down and stay down. These people are still struggling to get sober. Maybe they don't want to be sober, but that's about 1/4 of the sample. So I wanted to show you this to give you this sense of how different the folks in the study were in terms of their drinking pattern. Okay, so what about spirituality and religiousness? About 3/4 believe in God, about 8% don't believe in God, and about 18% said, no, I don't know, can't do. And that's a little bit lower number of people who believe in God than was in a national sample, where it's like 83% or something like that. This is an interesting one. Percent without a current religious preference. It's like 1/3 of the group doesn't have a current religious preference, which is okay. But in this national sample, where we looked at everybody in the country, only 14% of the U.S. population at that point had no religious preference. So you can see that we have some, maybe it's true that alcoholics are religiously alienated. And we can speculate about why that might be the case. But a lot of people were brought up in a religious tradition. Not everybody by any means, but not that many are currently practicing that religion or are involved in a religious congregation. And then there's this one, which I thought was really interesting. We asked everybody, to what extent do you think that you consider yourself religious? And people had to answer on a scale from 1 to 4, right? And our sample of folks, in terms of how religious people were, they were kind of lowish. This is a national sample, the same national sample I talked about before. That's significantly different, in case you wondered. So our folks are definitely don't think of themselves as being religious. But check this one out. Do you consider yourself spiritual? Oh, yeah. And the national sample, sort of, yeah. Look. So my thought is that alcoholics may be religiously alienated, but they're not spiritually alienated. That spirituality is still something that's accessible and of interest to somehow or another make that connection with, whether you want to call it a higher power or just greater meaning in life or things that are mysterious that we don't understand, and other fundamental ways of knowing. So, this is where we start to get into change and spirituality and religiousness. Does it change? How much does it change? Does change have anything to do with drinking more or less? That kind of stuff. So this is a horrible chart. You probably can't see it in the back. I apologize. So these are all the different measures of spirituality and religiousness that we used. And the columns are their baseline score and their score at 1 year. And the things in bold are the things that change significantly. So you've got private religious practices. So people are praying more, mostly praying, but there's some people who got into meditation, but not that many. Some reading the Bible, things like that. But this isn't about going to a religious service or anything like that. Daily spiritual experiences also increased, significantly. And all 3 forgiveness scales forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, and negative religious coping improved. You want it to drop, and it did. And purpose in life increased significantly. So people are changing, even without, whatever it is that's going on in their lives that supports this change on these kind of dimensions is happening. So does it have anything to do with drinking? Well, it turns out that your drinking levels at 15 months are predicted by these changes from baseline to 1 year in these variables, specifically for these 4 variables: private religious practices, daily spiritual experiences, forgiveness of self, and purpose in life. Not predictive was people's perceptions of God as loving or controlling, or people's specific beliefs. Do I believe in a God or not? Their use of religious coping strategies, forgiveness of others dropped out, which surprised a lot of us. And then this meaning, values, and beliefs measure that we had. So it was I thought that was pretty interesting, that it would be what you do should be such a big driver of this here, and what you experience, what your daily experiences are, and coming to terms with oneself, and with where we are in life. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next one. This is about perceptions of AA's helpfulness, and we wanted to know, so how many people in this sample think AA is helpful? How many think it's not helpful? And which folks found it helpful? Which ones didn't? And do these perceptions of AA's helpfulness, not helpfulness, have anything to do with drinking outcomes? And what elements of AA are perceived as helpful or not helpful? So we're just trying to, get a little bit better sense of what's going on there. We asked everybody at 18 months, a year and a half into the study, what do you think helps people with alcohol problems? And we wanted to know what they thought, We wanted to know, well, do you think this helps? But it was an open-ended question, so it was whatever they volunteered. So if they didn't say anything about AA, then this is where we put them, we counted them in here. 42% had made comments that indicated AA had been helpful to them. 18% gave these kind of mixed comments. Well, it's good, but, blah, blah, sort of thing. And then 19% found AA unhelpful to them. Okay. So who found AA helpful? People who had a prior history of alcohol treatment. They had a family history. They had high levels of alcohol-related problems. Their alcoholism was more severe. They wanted to be abstinent, not surprising, right? Since that's AA's message there. And they had attended AA before, they'd been exposed to it before, they were familiar with it. It wasn't a new thing. But there were no differences by demographic variables, by age, gender, ethnicity, any of those kinds of things. It didn't seem to make a difference in terms of who found it helpful. What was more important was people's treatment history, AA history, wanting to be abstinent, and basically by being in a position to benefit from AA, I think. So this is a little bit busy, but let me explain. So what we're looking at is percent heavy drinking days. So you can see they started out with lots of heavy drinking. And the people in blue are the people who found AA helpful. The people in green are those who had mixed comments. The brick color, reddish color, the people who said AA was not helpful. And the yellow is the people who didn't even mention it. Okay? So then this is looking at their drinking over time. And this is really interesting, that this is when we asked them this question. And these folks who found AA not helpful are having a hard time getting sober. You know, they're drinking about 20% of the days, or over 20% of the days, they're drinking. This is a note down here at the bottom. Heavy drinking days for men are 5 or more standard drinks. For women, it's 4 or more. So we had to count. My blessed research assistants did this. What would we do without them? What did people say is helpful about AA? This is nothing surprising, is it? The fellowship, sharing, talking, listening, having someone to talk to, being around others who've been there, sober people, sort of the sense of community, I think. Some people really talked about the program itself, the steps, the meetings, the sponsors, the big book, so other things. And then there were some other things that were mentioned, spirituality, specifically advice, guidance. And I like this quote, it helps you not to drink. And then what's not helpful? And this is kind of interesting. I can't relate to groups. I don't like groups in general, you know. So, and there's always some of us who are going to feel that way. Some people thought it was too negative, it was too much complaining, it was depressing. Some other people had issues with the God, higher power thing, which is probably not a surprise to you either. I thought I could handle it on my own. Is that familiar? I didn't like the structure of the language about AA. Some people were really annoyed about court-ordered people. Some people didn't think they were that bad, not like those people. So there wasn't, there's some really interesting issues. People talk too much about drinking. I like that one. At an AA meeting, we're not supposed to talk about drinking. Okay. People are hypocritical, phony. And some people just said, look, I needed more than AA, you know. It wasn't what I needed. And then you get this whole range of other comments just made by a few people. But it's harder to lump these as compared to what is helpful about AA questions. I'm zipping through this. I'll turn around and we'll be done. So let me do this. Open it up for questions. We've kind of gone through 2 sections at this point in the presentation. The first one around spirituality and religiousness and changes in drinking, and then moving into this kind of questions. So any questions or comments? Did you want to say something?
Although I was just commenting that I've been reading up on Dr. Jung, and I saw that comment in a letter to Bill Wilson around June 1961, and I was just commenting. I'm looking forward to your comments on Dr. Jung's study.
Well, that's all I know is that letter. And he wrote a letter to Bill W. in which he basically proposed that what's going on with alcoholism is that we are replacing one type of spirit with another when we get caught in alcoholism. So that's why the spiritus comes spiritum, which is Latin for spirit. Yeah.
So you showed a while back a graph that had different clusters of people and drinking patterns with major groups. And I'm wondering if you know offhand what that looked like broken down into groups, your different samples. So
the VA people did much better than rumor would have it, which was really interesting. I mean, both treatment samples did better than those who weren't in treatment in terms of drinking outcomes. I don't remember if we looked at those clusters and how that related to the different sites. But I do know that we did a survival analysis days to first drink. It's a cute little chart. But it shows that those who are in treatment are slower to relapse, if they do relapse, than those who are not in treatment. The community sample and the community and the DrinkWise sample. Yeah.
So with there was an alcoholic like that, and our minds like make up our reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all you have a spiritual contact with a higher power. Couldn't you use that as a recovery program instead of AA?
Yeah, I don't think that you have to go to AA. There's some clear advantages to AA in the sense that you're not alone and you've got some social support for staying sober. But, like this, not all of us want to be in groups. Not all of us some of us have a hard time connecting with people in groups. And as I understand it, lots of different AA groups are really different. And so it may take a while kind of shopping around to find the AA group that you're most comfortable with. But that was one of my questions all along, is do people get sober without AA? Sure. Do they stay sober without AA? Yeah. Is it a white knuckle recovery? Maybe, maybe not. And it's not necessarily true that a non-AA recovery is people hanging on by the skin of their teeth kind of thing. So there's a lot more variation, I think, in how people recover than we're really aware of. We sort of talk about it like it's a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, but it's not. We each have to find our own way to being sober. What else? Yeah.
So one of your groups was community members that realized they had a problem with alcohol, so it made me question if there were times when people would hop to a different group, like when they started checking out AA or the moderation group or...
No, yeah, we only had one or two cases where somebody who was in the VA suddenly showed up in the community sample, and we just kept him in the VA sample because that's where we first picked him up. But there were just one or two people like that. The word did get out in the homeless community that we were paying people to talk to them if they had alcohol problems. So we have quite a few homeless people in our community sample.
So the people that attended AA, aside from the comments there,
Yeah.
did you delve in a little deeper to see whether or not some were working the steps, the 12 steps, or some were just the meeting attendance? Was that?
Yeah, we have that data, and actually our measure of AA involvement is a measure of how much you're working on things, and do you feel a part of AA and things like that. It's not just how many meetings you've attended. We found the number of meetings you say you attended wasn't really predicting anything.
Right.
It was more useful to look at basically is the person involved, are they doing the work?
Doing the work on themselves.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I'd be interested to know the percentage of the people that have profound spiritual experiences.
Okay, that's where we're going next. All right. At each time we saw them every 6 months, we would ask them if they had a life-changing spiritual religious experience. At the beginning it was, have you ever, and then after that it was, since we saw you last. Or have you ever had a gain in faith or a loss of faith? And I have to tell you, I'm a daughter of a minister, and I got exposed to a fair amount of religiosity as a child, and am very skeptical about these life-changing spiritual experiences. So this got thrown in because of other people's interests, and because it was in an existing measure, and I didn't expect that we would find anything. So that's always kind of interesting. So at baseline, we found out that 47% of our samples said that they had had a life-changing spiritual religious experience, versus in a national sample, 39%. So we've got this seems to be a much more common event amongst alcoholics to have these kinds of experiences, which would reinforce Jung's point about that there is some fundamental spiritual craving that is not met by alcohol. 42% in our sample, almost as many as had had a life-changing spiritual religious experience, talked about having experienced a loss of faith. We don't have national data on that, unfortunately, so we can't really compare our folks to that. But it's almost as many who'd had a life-changing spiritual experience. So what kinds of experiences are people talking about? And we asked them that. This is a part of, let me sit down and just ask you questions, part of the interview. I put this one clump, I called it danger. I shoulda, coulda, I might have died. Car accidents, house fires, other things like that, where the person felt like they had been saved from certain death by something mysterious. And then there's another clump of people's efforts to deliberately connect with the transcendent, with God, with spirit, whether it was in a religious context or maybe being out in nature and appreciating the beauty of nature. Kind of things. And then there was a bunch of other experiences ranging from the mundane to going to AA. Someone's life-changing spiritual religious experience was in AA. Someone else, it was talking with someone. For someone else, it was when their kids were born. Being in nature, creative work, creating something artistic or something fun. And these experiences were generally positive. People felt at peace, people felt consoled, they felt a presence, they felt connected. A couple people talked about grandmothers, perceiving their grandmothers, feeling like their grandmother was there. And often she was chiding them to get their act together. So there's in that sense of feeling a presence, feeling connected, accepting physical sensations. So we're all very benevolent. But some people's experiences, some people's life-changing spiritual religious experiences were more negative. They were scared, they felt judged, they felt alienated, they were questioning God, they were angry at God, which is perfectly reasonable to get mad at God sometimes. So it was a range of things that people talked about. So, and it turns out that from the very beginning of the study, from the first time we talked to them, that there is a relationship between having had such experiences and how much people drink. That if you've had these experiences, you tend to drink less, which is kind of interesting. Who would have thought? More abstinent than those who haven't had such experiences, and fewer heavy drinking. The other two columns are not significant. So then, what about loss of faith? And we've kind of organized and categorized people's responses when we asked them, well, what is, when you say you've had a loss of faith experience, what was that like? And for some people, it was this gradual loss of involvement in faith or religion, this disillusionment with, specifically with religion. And for some people, it was a much more active alienation, rejection from a religious congregation, a religion, a doctrine, a priest, or from God. A lot of people felt a loss of faith when someone close to them died. And other negative events, which we kind of lumped together because they were just a real mix of divorce, abuse, affairs, natural disasters, war, accidents. There were some vets who had been in the Gulf War, mental illness, things like that. And a few of these loss of faith experiences were while they were using drugs or alcohol. And there's always a few people who give you such a vague answer, you just put them in this category. I don't know. Turns out that amongst women, this was the first thing we noticed, that women were more likely to talk about this kind of loss of faith situation or this one, where there was issues of affairs or accidents or divorce or feeling judged by the congregation or by a priest or by a minister or something like that. And then we looked at men versus women in terms of having a loss of faith at all at baseline when we first talked to them. And about slightly more than 50% of the women have reported having had a loss of faith, whereas the men reported more like 37, 38% of them had a loss of faith, which we found rather intriguing. And so Amanda Price, smart woman that she is, cooked this up. You want to notice the pink bar, but let me tell you also what you're looking at. This is days since last drink, average days since last drink. So the higher the number, the better, right? By gender and by whether or not people had had a loss of faith. This is over the first 12 months of the study. And you can see what happens to the women with the loss of faith. That's that pink bar. And they're slowly starting to get more sober toward after a year, but it's almost like they're 6 months or more behind the other groups. That there's something more that needs to be processed, that needs to be worked on around this issue of loss of faith. And because we didn't know that this was going to be an issue, we can't go back and talk to those folks and say, so what was that about? You know, what was going on for you at that point? And we can speculate, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what might be going on there. For men, there's no significant correlation between the age of onset and the age at which this loss of faith occurred, but there was for women. So early 20s would be right around when this would have happened. And we looked at the data more closely, and we found that for women, the loss of faith occurred shortly before the onset of alcoholism. And whereas for men, the loss of faith occurred after. So it's almost like for women, the drinking is a reaction to the loss of faith, the heavy drinking and onset of alcoholism. I mean, there probably was drinking going on before, but that kind of thing. So, any comments about this before we go on? I can tell you what I think. Women generally tend to be more involved with spirituality, with religious institutions for sure. Next time you're in church, if you ever find yourself in a church, look around. Most of the congregation are women. This is a much more vivid, much more important issue, I think, for many women than it is for men. So if a woman discovers that her experiences around drinking are making the rounds in the church and she's being condemned, and if there's some sexual acting out or a rape that occurs as a consequence of this, she's going to get blamed by most congregations, by most ministers. And I think that that's probably where some of this comes from, is that kind of judgment. it's okay if the guys get drunk because they're supposed to get drunk, right? But a woman isn't supposed to do that, particularly a woman who's involved in a religious congregation. So that's my theory. What do you think? Yeah?
Well, you know, like in the church setting, I think a lot of women, like, you don't see a women praise or a girl altar boy, you know, it's all, you know, like I'm Greek Orthodox, and, you know, when they call people to listen, you know, all the guys come out with their own, so like, it's really like it's a man's job, or kind of thing.
Yeah. It's true. You know, the women are very involved in the church, but the reality is that the church is run by men. And so there isn't that sense of being an equal member of the group.
Do you think there's any correlation between trauma as causing both a loss of faith and a descent into alcoholism?
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be at all surprised. And there might very well be some blaming the victim going on in some congregations, in some groups, among some people that would blame her for that kind of situation. Yeah.
I also think that perhaps people have been told that all the problems are caused by this drinking, and so they stop drinking for a year, they still have all the problems,
Uh-huh.
they're likely to lose faith.
Yeah, well, and you know, and part of it, of course, is what was our expectation around our faith. I remember one person I was interviewing. She explained her loss of faith was because she prayed to God for a fishing rod, and He never gave her one, and therefore she had loss of faith. She didn't believe in God anymore. So one question, of course, is, well, what's your perception of God? And the interesting thing is a lot of these people who had a loss of faith still believed in God. It was really more of a loss of faith in the institution, I think, in terms of being a part of a community of people who believe together the same things. Yeah.
I wonder how much of a life event there is during a struggle with substance abuse that leads one to want to explain it with, via some kind of structure, via some kind of authority, via some kind of explanation, which they may or may not believe even exists, but at that point the desperation leads them to feel that they have to go somewhere for some kind of guidance and some kind of structure and explanation.
I think that very often we clutch at people, institutions who can explain something to us, even though there may not really be an explanation. Emmylou Harris has this line in one of her songs, "Let the mystery be." And it's really hard for us to do that. It's really hard for us to not try to, well, now why did that happen? And what does it mean that, as soon as I said my mother's name, this happened, I suddenly found myself overwhelmed, or whatever. And that becomes my life-changing spiritual religious experience or something.
I'm an atheist, and it's very, very, very difficult to make any sense of anything, and there is no structure, there is no authority, that's why I'm asking that.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's a tough position. It's a tough position. Yeah.
Did you say that it was about 20 that women usually had loss of faith?
The age of onset for the women in our sample was in their early 20s.
And for the men, do you remember?
For the men, it was just a little bit older. It was 20s, 25.
So the heavy drinking for most people didn't start in their teens?
Oh, no, it did. It did. It just did. The point at which we asked this question, when did you first begin to have problems from your alcohol use? And of course, what I tell you in answer to that question depends on what I'm thinking of as a big problem. You know, the fact that I missed my high school graduation because I missed running this contract or whatever. You know, you make up your story, you know. You know, we all have, am I going to tell you that? Am I going to admit to that? You know, or will I say, well, it was when I got my third DUI. You know, that kind of thing. So we have to take what people tell us because that's the nature of a survey research. I ask you a question, you tell me something of, you know, what you think, what you feel, what your experience is. I write it down, that's what we analyze.
So if that's the case, then maybe this is just women's recollection. They weren't emotionally attached to the alcoholism during their loss of faith. You know, so maybe that's not when their alcoholism was developed. Maybe that's just when they could pinpoint it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that it's all tangled up together, you know, and that's why, actually we have a caveat coming up. No one study tells you everything. You always have to do another study in order to, like, really nail down, well, what's going on here with the women? You know, why is this so undermines their recovery, and what can we do about it? How can we help women? Because there's lots of ways to regain one's faith besides joining a church or, you know, fill in the blanks, whatever means something, whatever that means to you. Maybe it's just a bit of a sense of not being alone in the world. And that's where AA is so handy, I think. Okay. Any other questions on this little tidbit? We'll go on. Okay. So what did we learn? We learned that alcoholics may be religiously alienated, but they're not necessarily spiritually alienated. And this is defining spirituality very broadly, so it's not necessarily about a God. You know, you can be spiritual and not believe in God. So, and I deliberately wanted that kind of a definition because I know that there's lots of alcoholics who are like, ugh. And changes in 3 dimensions of spirituality were associated with less drinking, private religious practices, forgiveness of self, and daily experiences of spirituality, and increases in purpose and meaning in life may also contribute to less drinking. And there's some, actually, Amy Krentzman, who analyzed some of this data with me, is looking at forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others in AA, and she finds it does play a role. So don't just decide you're not going to care about forgiving those other people. It's still worth doing, just for your own sake. So AA is helpful by 60% of the sample. And perceiving AA as helpful is associated with better drinking outcomes. Life-changing spiritual religious experiences are more common in alcoholics than in the general population, or at least that's what we found. This is one study. Women alcoholics are more likely to report a loss of faith, and it seems to be harder to recover if you're a woman and you've had a loss of faith. So this is the warning that I mentioned. This is one study with one population. We don't know if this finding is generalized to all alcoholics or to addicts or to anybody who's not from the Midwest. And I mean, who knows what we would find if we could interview alcoholics who don't think they have a problem. You know, I think that would be a whole other set of responses, right? It's going to be very different than those who, yeah, I know I got a problem here. You know, you had to get into the study, you at least had to be able to acknowledge that and respond to the advertisement that we put into the newspaper was all about saying, well, yeah, I do have an alcohol problem. And these are all the people who helped us. I especially want to thank everybody who participated in the study, but we no longer have any identifying information on who they are, and we can't contact them, so we can't say thank you. But if you ever heard of anyone talk about the life transition study, tell them Libby said thank you. The other people, the other researchers were Dr. Brower. He's an addiction psychiatrist at U of M, at UMass. Amy Krentzman, Jim Cranford, and John Webb. If you're the sort of person who likes to go digging in the academic literature, you search for their names, and you'll find what we have published on this. And of course, all of our research assistants and the people who funded us. So, any questions? I'll zip through that fast. So. Yeah.
Did you look at any other mental health problems, like acknowledge them, like depression or anything like that?
We didn't diagnose whether or not people had depression or anxiety disorders or stuff like that. We did measure symptoms, so we have a measure of how depressed people felt or how anxious people felt. And as you might expect, those scores got better as people got sober. The more time sober they had under their belt, the better that improved. Although you probably are all aware that depression may take a while, so that after you stop drinking. Other question? Yeah.
And in comparison to people that felt success of going to AA as opposed to reuniting or joining a religious affiliation or participating in religious groups.
Can you say that again? I didn't quite catch it.
Any comparison to success of people feeling like they were, whether it's in their recovery in AA as opposed to just going back to a religious service or joining.
I see what you're saying. We had a few people whose recovery was, I would say, like it was in their church, and that was it was a supportive environment for them, and they were able to support their recovery that way. I don't have data on for whom that was a better route than going to AA. My perceptions as one of you who did a lot of interviews was that it wasn't that common. But I assume that there are people who do that, and it's important to establish that because AA isn't the only way. Excuse me, AA isn't the only way to get sober, to support your recovery, and it's valuable to tap into whatever sources of support you can find.
I didn't quite get it meeting up with your group study that you had. What percentage had no exposure whatsoever to AA?
It was, I think, 30.
Had no exposure whatsoever.
No, I wouldn't put it that way. Well, they said at baseline, 68, only 68% had been said that they'd been exposed to AA before, at the very beginning of the study. So that means that 32% had not been exposed to AA before then. They knew, a lot of people knew of it. And some people said, well, yeah, I've been exposed to AA, but I've never been to a meeting. Which probably means that they've seen the big book or they've talked to somebody, that kind of stuff. Is that helpful? So a lot of these people never had not, at baseline, when we first interviewed them, had not gotten involved in AA. But those who were in treatment, especially the VA and Chelsea Arbor, very 12-step oriented programs.
In the end, all of them are supposed to AA.
No, no, no. This is purely data collection. We didn't say, okay, those people go to AA and those people don't. We didn't do anything like that. We just talked to people. And we found out whether they went to AA, and we found out if they went to church, and we found out stuff like that. But we didn't try to analyze if this group goes to AA, what happens? If that group goes to AA, what happens? It was very much natural history, what's going on out there in the world of alcoholics who are trying to recover.
One other question on the Carl Jung there.
Yeah.
How much paperwork did he actually write about alcoholism or addiction?
I don't know, do you know?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit.
It
It was an issue, wasn't it?
Carl Jung believed very strongly that the solution to alcoholism was finding a spirit, higher power.
Groups we go into,
Pardon me?
actual case studies.
He did actual case studies. It was the letter we talked about earlier.
Well, that's only that one letter. I mean, the actual, how many clients do you have that were alcoholic or addicted?
I don't know.
But he has written a lot, and he's talked to a lot of people. It isn't just this one person in this letter. But you could dig into it. You Google it. Yeah, and let us know.
He's claiming that there's not very much on actual addiction studies. He only cites one case where he had a client that had an over-dominating mother.
Those over-dominating mothers.
He blamed the alcohol.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not saying that he's like God Almighty. Who is? But but it's an interesting idea, and kind of intriguing. Sorry. Okay, we can keep going. All right. Yeah.
During the course of the survey, was there any data that maybe indicated or even tracked people after the relapse had a stronger recovery? We didn't really, we haven't actually answered that question, but that's a good question. I know Amy did some really interesting work looking at patterns over time in drinking and then periods of abstinence. I mean, this is the way it goes, right? I'm sober. Oh, bam. Drinking. Oh, well, huh. And then sober. And then a period of sobriety. And so she was analyzing some of that kind of stuff, but I don't think she looked at that. That's a good question. Yeah.
Are you saying that women in general have a hard time recovering from alcoholism, or just the women without faith?
The women who had a loss of faith, for them, it was harder. It was harder to get sober. And it had something to do with faith, and it may have to do with trauma, and with, you remember that when I was talking about the negative coping, negative religious coping scale? If you're carrying around this idea that God is punishing you, or that you're a wretched person, and God is judging you, that's a big mountain to climb over, to recover from. I mean, that's part of your recovery. It becomes figuring out, well, maybe God isn't this malevolent creature that's out here. And there were some people in the study who really didn't, if you ask them, do you think God is love? No. That's all fire and brimstone. Yeah.
Were you astonished at the percent, the almost 68% that had attended AA?
No.
Is that quite high?
Yeah, I expect because we're drawing from treatment samples, and it didn't have to be their first treatment episode. So, there could be people who've been in and out of treatment a bunch, and of course, in this area, if you're in treatment, you'll be exposed to AA.
So going into your study,
Uh-huh.
you pretty much expected, you expected then that there would be, that AA would be included in this.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, our analyses of the spiritual religious change and drinking, we controlled for how much people were involved in AA. Because AA is associated with being sober, and AA is associated with spirituality and religiousness and spiritual religious change. So we wanted to, so what we found was independent of AA involvement.
So it talks about, in the 12 steps, it talks about, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps.
Right.
So was that, like, you delved in a little?
Yeah, we did ask that question, and people who had a spiritual awakening were more likely to be sober. But some people, we also got the feeling that some people would tell you that they had one, but they didn't. It was just, they would tell you what they thought you wanted to hear. And that's the nature of survey research, You ask people questions and they tell you things. Maybe they're being honest with you and themselves.
Because that's actually doing the work. That's what they call doing the work.
Right, yeah, and so somebody who was new to recovery, I would wonder, unless it was independent of AA involvement. Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like everybody had reasons.
Not everybody. No, not everybody. Yeah, no, not everybody. I mean, certainly after the third month, there was a group of people who were sober, 0 drinks from that point on. So, yeah.
If I understand what you're saying correctly, it sounds like they would suggest that people who don't have a specific religious belief can engage in AA and be successful, whether they do or do not have a specific religious belief. And I've read that people who successfully engage in AA, that there's no difference between how successful they are related to whether they have a specific religious belief or not, but that does relate very heavily to whether they can initially engage in AA. So is there any data that you've seen that would suggest what do the people who don't have a specific religious belief do differently when they're able to engage in AA versus those who aren't able to engage in
AA? We didn't look at that, but that would be, that's the kind of question Amy would love to investigate. I should give you her email. But yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see if, the extent to which people's belief gets in the way of or helps them get involved with AA. And there's a whole bunch of data that we have on what do you think God is, which we haven't analyzed, which I think is a real issue. And I think that one of the things that happens is, as we get sober, is that our ideas about God get bigger. And we're no longer thinking that God is this guy up in the sky who's got a thunderbolt who's going to get us if we step out of line. And it's a much more, it's this idea of God being everywhere, and this idea that God is beyond our understanding. Those kinds of ideas, I think, can be helpful. Yeah, somebody in the back. Yeah.
I was just curious, there seems to be a pretty significant statistical difference between alcoholics and their ideas of spirituality versus the normal population. I was just wondering, maybe that's, like going back to something you said earlier, more attributable to the fact that a lot of alcoholics have a lot of things in their lives that are out of control. Might be like reaching for something that can explain things positively or negatively.
Right.
That are happening to them, kind of alleviating some of their own responsibility.
I don't know if it's so much about relieving responsibility.
It's not, that sounded differently than how it was interpreted in my own head.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's more of that feeling like my life is out of control. I need something to kind of hold on to
Right.
kind of explain why I think things are happening with it,
Right.
and how that kind of maybe contributes to alcoholism.
I don't
makes you more susceptible to alcoholism. I think that's a very human thing that you find with lots and lots and lots of people. Wanting to explain things that are unexplainable. And it's just, I think it's part of being a human being, is wanting to explain things. Now, if we latch on to this, and this is our explanation, and it's, I don't want to give any examples and offend anybody, but, you know, I mean, there are some people giving you explanations of what's going on in the world who are like pretty off base and who aren't going to be whatsoever, you know. And so you have to, I'm sure part of the recovery process is, okay, who's helpful, who's really helpful, and who isn't.
I guess I was thinking of it more just in like a sense, like a certain sensitivity to that idea.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As a group, it seems like alcoholics versus the normal population are kind of more sensitive to this idea of spirituality or spiritual plane. It seems to be, you know, significant enough that that sensitivity per se might have some correlation.
Yeah.
To why they internalize things in a way that makes them.
That's an interesting idea.
Question.
Yeah. Let me catch her with that. Okay.
I just wondered if you had heard about, there was a famous guy through Hazleton, his name is Bernie Larson, and he made tapes about people's concept of God, and he believed that that had a significant impact on people's ability to recover. And I just wondered if you would agree.
No, I think so. I mean, I definitely think so, but I would, I'd love to hear what you found. That'd be really interesting.
Did you imply that women are more spiritual than men?
Well, women are more involved, to be precise. Women are more involved in religious institutions than men.
Is there any reason why?
I don't know of a reason, but we could certainly sit here and speculate. But, you know, we don't really know. Is it because women have a greater sense of we can't control things? There's, you know, that's a harder thing for guys to come to terms with. And so we're more willing to turn it over to a higher power. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head.
I was just going to ask about the mortality of your participants.
Yeah.
It sounded like you had about 4.5%
Yeah.
that you lost over the span of 3 years.
Yeah.
So if you could add any, or speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, some people it was obviously related to alcohol use. A couple of them were really tragic. A homeless guy. And one was a motorcycle accident. And was she drinking? Maybe. We don't know. I mean, we didn't go dig up the record. Yeah. And we would find out if so-and-so was no longer in the study because,
In my case, I don't know where this fits in, and I don't know if I can get a question out of it. But in my case, I was raised with a vengeful God, right out of, matter of fact, right out of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. And after 2 years in AA, I decided to visit the issue. I just selected a Unitarian Universalist church, and I'm very happy.
Yeah. I mean, there are churches that are, that don't carry that kind of freight about God. Yeah.
I just have a clarifying question. There was one of your first graphs that had 4 different groups, and they had really different trajectories. There was the one group that I just wanted to know how those groups were split up. I don't know if I can say.
Oh, that's the magic of.
It's kind of far back there.
The magic of statistics. This was I was reading it today.
sound distribution. I forget the name of the analysis you used.
So just kind of split everyone up into different groups, like how we
Right,
all of those?
right. Everybody, the groups were put together by looking at statistically how they hung together based on drinks per drinking day. And then we charted it over time, and then we also looked at, well, how do these 4 different groups vary on a whole bunch of other variables, and I didn't want to bury you under too much stuff. I feel like I've already done too much of that. But we thought this was really interesting, you know, that the majority of the group of the sample are doing much better, but there are some people who are really still struggling. Good question out there? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Pardon me? The yellow group. You mean who were they in terms of were they men, women, which side they were from? I couldn't tell you. My guess is that given that they became sober, that they're probably from one of the treatment centers, either the VA or Chelsea Harvard. Although there were some people in the community group who, when we first interviewed them, their lives were pretty messy. And then the next time we saw this guy, he had gotten sober, and the next time we saw him after that, he had a job, he was driving a truck. And he was driving this big semi that she had parked behind the building. But, I mean, so he had a roof over his head. And he never got back into treatment. He was a community sample person he'd been in treatment many years ago. And he just kind of said, well, I've got to get back and do something about this. And this is what I can afford to do. You know, I can't afford treatment. I don't have benefits. So there, yeah, I mean, I think there were some, so I can't say for sure at this moment, because I haven't had that data in front of me, what each of these different groups are like. So, sorry, yeah.
So with regard to this graph, are you saying that there were general patterns between, or just looking at all of the data and you clustered them together like a cluster analysis?
Yeah, yeah, you can think
So
of it.
that yellow line could be from all 4.
Oh, yeah.
We don't know, but
Yeah.
that's just, those are the general patterns.
Right.
So then if that's the case, I'm curious to know what separates the people in the green line from the others, because the others seem to be doing pretty well, especially with the people in yellow.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you noticed something or if you looked into what some of their responses were on some of the other things that you were measuring, like
We actually published a paper on this, and where we described these groups in more detail. But my memory is that groups tended to be older. They were drinking much more heavily at the beginning of the study. They tended to be men. Very few women in that group.
what was the measure of alcohol or AA involvement that you used?
It's Tonigan's measure. Geez, you know your measures. Yeah.
I see that there's evidently some kind of correlation between spirituality, retaining it or losing it, and recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any research or data on how much of it is cause and how much is the effect?
No, we don't know. We don't know. My guess is, Jessica and I were speculating, is that there's it's probably a bundle of stuff that's happening at about the same time. That's probably leading to this. You know, right? We just don't have enough information. I mean, you might, those of you women in the audience who are in recovery, you might check around with the other women that you know in recovery.
what was it that was responsible for the loss of faith? Somehow I don't think it's about not getting a fishing rod. I think it's a heck of a lot more serious than that. And it would be useful to know what it was. I was hoping I could write a grant, but NIAAA doesn't have the money these days to fund research on recovery. All right. Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.